It was an endless green sawgrass stretched toward the Everglades were dying, and this was the last resort. What followed?
There are moments in history when the world looks at a decision and collectively bursts into laughter. Florida gave the world one of those moments. When officials announced they were deliberately releasing thousands of a particular creature into the wild to combat one of the most devastating ecological disasters in American history, the internet erupted. Late-night hosts ran with it. Social media memes spread faster than the invasion itself, and even seasoned environmentalists raised skeptical eyebrows. But while everyone was busy laughing, something remarkable was quietly unfolding deep inside the swamps and pine forests of the Sunshine State. The truth behind that decision would eventually silence every critic, and it starts with understanding just how catastrophic things had already become. To truly grasp why Florida took such a drastic step, you need to picture what the Everglades once looked like. Spanning nearly 1.5 million acres, this vast subtropical wilderness was one of the most biologically rich ecosystems on the entire planet. Wading birds dotted the shallow waters by the thousands. White-tailed deer moved through the sawgrass prairies. Raccoons, possums, marsh rabbits, and bobcats filled every corner of this extraordinary landscape. Scientists and naturalists described it as irreplaceable, a slow-moving river of grass that had sustained life for thousands of years. It was, in every sense of the word, alive. Then it started dying, not with an explosion or a dramatic event that made headlines. It died quietly, species by species, until the silence became impossible to ignore. Surveys conducted by wildlife researchers painted a horrifying picture. Raccoon populations in some areas of South Florida had plummeted by over 99%. Possums had nearly vanished. Bobcat sightings had dropped dramatically. Marsh rabbits, once so common they were practically background scenery, had become genuinely rare. The predator responsible for this silent apocalypse wasn't a disease, wasn't climate change, and wasn't human development. It slithered, and it had been hiding in plain sight for years. The Burmese python is native to the jungles and grasslands of Southeast Asia, where it exists as part of a carefully balanced ecosystem. In Florida, it exists as something else entirely, an apex predator with no natural checks, no native enemies, and an almost supernatural ability to thrive in a foreign land. How it got there is a story of human carelessness compounded over decades. Some snakes escaped from a breeding facility destroyed by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Others were released by pet owners who underestimated how large these animals would grow. A python that starts life as a curious exotic pet can eventually reach lengths exceeding 18 feet and weigh well over 100 pounds. Many owners simply let them go, imagining the swamp would somehow absorb them. It did, and then some. What nobody anticipated was how perfectly suited the Burmese python would be to Florida's environment. The subtropical heat mirrors its native climate. The dense vegetation provides ideal cover for an animal that is already one of nature's most effective ambush hunters. The abundance of prey, deer, birds, alligators, and everything in between gave the snakes an unlimited food supply. With no predators to fear and reproduction unchecked, the population exploded into what scientists now estimate could be anywhere between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals. Spread across South Florida, a single female can produce clutches of between 50 and 100 eggs at a time. The math was devastating, and for years, no management strategy came close to reversing it. Florida didn't sit idle. Officials tried everything that common sense and conservation science suggested. Public hunting programs were launched, offering cash prizes to whoever could remove the most snakes. The Florida Python Challenge became an annual event drawing hundreds of participants from across the country, armed with traps, tracking tools, and determination. Despite impressive participation numbers and genuine effort, the results were sobering. Hundreds of snakes removed per event sound significant until you realize it represents a fraction of a single % of the estimated total population. Professional contract hunters were deployed year-round, working full-time to locate and remove pythons from the swamps. Drones equipped with thermal cameras scanned the wetlands from above. Researchers even fitted certain snakes with radio transmitters, turning them into unwilling scouts designed to lead scientists to hidden breeding clusters. None of it was enough. Experts publicly acknowledged what many had privately feared for years. Complete eradication of the Burmese python from Florida is almost certainly impossible. The snakes are too numerous, too well hidden, and too reproductively efficient. Every snake removed is replaced by dozens born elsewhere in the swamp. Researchers continued their work not with optimism of victory, but with the humbler goal of containment. For an ecosystem already shattered, containment felt like losing in slow motion. It was inside this climate of frustration and near despair that scientists began reconsidering a question that conservation biology had wrestled with for generations. What if the only real solution was a natural one? The eastern indigo snake doesn't look like a savior. At first glance, it looks like, well, another snake, growing up to 8 or 9 feet long, with scales that shimmer in deep blue-black tones and a throat flushed with coral red. It is undeniably beautiful. But beauty wasn't what made Florida officials decide to reintroduce thousands of them into the wild. What mattered was behavior. The eastern indigo snake is one of the most remarkable predators in North American wildlife history. It is non-venomous, poses virtually no threat to humans, and yet within its ecosystem, it operates like a highly efficient apex predator. It eats almost anything: rodents, birds, frogs, lizards, and crucially, other snakes. It is completely immune to rattlesnake venom and has been documented consuming venomous species without hesitation. Most importantly, for Florida's crisis, juvenile Burmese pythons fall squarely within its diet. Once, this snake was everywhere across the American Southeast. Its range stretched across Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond. It was an anchor species, a predator whose presence shaped the behavior and population of everything around it. But as longleaf pine forests were cleared for agriculture and development, as gopher tortoise populations declined, and with them the burrows that indigo snakes depend on for shelter, the eastern indigo began disappearing. By the late 20th century, it had vanished from vast portions of its native range. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed it as a threatened species. What had once been a keystone predator of southern ecosystems had become a conservation concern, reduced to isolated pockets in Florida and small remnant populations in Georgia. When Florida announced the reintroduction program, releasing these snakes into restored habitat areas as a biological countermeasure against the python invasion, the public reaction was immediate and merciless. Critics compared it to the infamous mongoose introduction in Hawaii, where a predator brought in to solve one problem created several new others, simply mocked the idea on its face. The state, already drowning in snakes, was releasing more snakes. Headlines wrote themselves. But what those headlines missed was the decades of careful scientific work that underpinned the program. Conservation teams had spent years breeding eastern indigo snakes in captivity, working to restore the longleaf pine habitat they depend on, and collaborating across state agencies and universities to prepare for exactly this kind of reintroduction. It was not impulsive. It was methodical. The results began coming in quietly, without fanfare, the way most genuine scientific progress does. In autumn 2023, at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in North Florida, trail cameras captured something that stopped researchers in their tracks. 2 wild-born eastern indigo snake hatchlings, offspring of previously released individuals, were recorded on camera. One of them bore no tracking tag, confirming it had been born entirely without human assistance. For the first time in roughly 50 years, eastern indigo snakes had reproduced naturally in North Florida. The reintroduction program hadn't just kept the snakes alive. It had reestablished a self-sustaining wild population. The sightings continued to accumulate through 2024 and into 2025. Researchers documented snakes from earlier release years still thriving and actively moving across multiple counties. A large adult male was recorded confidently navigating restored scrubland. A female from the 2019 cohort was confirmed still alive and healthy, representing years of successful wild survival. In neighboring Alabama, An additional 44 snakes were released in 2025, adding to over 500 that had been returned to their native range across the broader region. Other states began watching the program closely, exploring whether similar reintroduction strategies could be applied to their own damaged ecosystems. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside Florida's swamps that nobody had quite predicted. Native predators were adapting. A trail camera captured footage of a bobcat, weighing barely 25 pounds, killing and consuming an adult Burmese python more than twice its size. Wildlife footage showed eastern indigo snakes consuming juvenile pythons. Alligators were documented taking smaller specimens. Florida panthers were occasionally recorded engaging them. Each individual event was small. Collectively, they represented something significant: the beginning of ecological pushback. Florida's native predators were slowly, haltingly, learning to incorporate an invasive species into their behavior. The ecosystem was not healed, but it was no longer entirely passive. The laughter has mostly faded now. What replaced it is something more complicated, a mixture of cautious optimism, genuine scientific respect, and a broader reckoning with how we think about conservation. The easy instinct when confronting an ecological disaster is to reach for simple, dramatic solutions. Bounty programs, mass removal campaigns, and technological interventions feel satisfying because they look like action. And they do matter. Every python removed is a net positive for the Everglades. But the eastern indigo snake reintroduction demonstrated something deeper and more enduring: that broken ecosystems often can't be fixed from the outside. They have to be rebuilt from within by restoring the relationships and species that once made them function. Florida's gamble worked not because it was reckless, but because it was patient. The scientists who designed the program understood that ecological recovery is measured in decades, not news cycles. They understood that mockery from people who hadn't read the research was not the same as scientific objection. And they understood that nature, when given the right conditions, has a profound capacity to recover. The eastern indigo snake is not a silver bullet. It will not single-handedly eliminate the Burmese python from Florida, but it is re-establishing a balance that was erased by human carelessness. One hatchling, one burrow, one restored acre of longleaf pine at a time. And that, it turns out, is exactly how ecosystems heal. Everyone laughed at Florida. The Everglades got the last word.